Hello, JJ here. Welcome back to the channel. I am doing a second episode of this audiobook series that I'm doing. So this will be episode 2 of my audiobook that I'm reading through this book at the moment. If you haven't joined, the book is on your screen now, so go check it out and buy it for yourself. It's a really interesting book, especially if you're into history. You'll really enjoy it. So thanks for all your support on the last one. I thought I'd do another episode. Let me just find the page. So if you want to follow along yourselves at home, I'm going to be starting from page 538. And if you enjoyed this episode, just before I get into it, please like and subscribe and share this with your friends for more content. Thanks, guys. Hitler, though his overtures were serious enough, had few expectations that Britain would show interest in a settlement, particularly once the British cabinet had announced that it was preparing for a war that would last at least 3 years. He was sure that the Western powers would try to hold out as long as possible until their armaments programs were complete. That would mark a danger point for Germany. Though a view not shared by his generals, he held the French military in some contempt. He had a high esteem of British resilience and fighting power. And behind the British, there was always the threat that in due course the Americans would intervene. So there was no time to lose. On the very day after his return to Berlin, with the shells still raining down on Warsaw, Hitler told his military leaders to prepare for an attack on the West that very autumn. Militarily, he declared, time, especially in the psychological and material sense, works against us. It was therefore essential that immediate plans for an attack against France be prepared. The rainy season would arrive within a few weeks. The Air Force would be better in spring. But we cannot wait, he insisted. If a settlement with Chamberlain were not possible, he would smash the enemy until he collapses. The defeat of France, it was plainly inferred, would force Britain to terms. The goal was to bring England to its knees, to destroy France. His favoured time for carrying out the attack was the end of October. The commanders-in-chief, even Goering, were taken aback, but none protested. Hitler casually threw his notes into the fire when he had finished speaking. 2 days later, Hitler told Rosenberg that he would propose a major peace conference to regulate all matters rationally. Rosenberg asked whether he intended to prosecute the war in the West. Naturally, replied Hitler. The Maginot Line, Rosenberg recorded him saying, was no longer a deterrent. If the English did not want peace, he would attack them with all means available and annihilate them. Again, his favourite phrase. Hitler's speech to the Reichstag on the 6th of October indeed held out, as he indicated to Rosenberg, the prospect of a conference of the leading nations to settle Europe's problems of peace and security. But a starting point was that the division of Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union was to remain. There would be no recreation of the Poland of the Versailles settlement. It would be peace on Hitler's terms, with no concessions on what he had won. He painted a lurid picture of death and destruction if the Western powers should decline his offer. He blamed the warmongering on a certain Jewish international capitalism and journalism, implying in particular Churchill and his supporters. If Churchill's view should prevail, he concluded, then Germany would fight, riding one of his main hobby horses, he added, "And November 1918 will never be repeated in German history." The speech amounted to an olive branch clenched in a mailed fist. Hitler's offer was dismissed by Chamberlain in a speech in the House of Commons 6 days later. It was what Hitler had expected. He had not waited. On the very day of his Reichstag speech, he stressed to Brautisch and Holder that a decisive move in the northwest was necessary to prevent a French advance that autumn through Belgium, threatening to the Ruhr. 2 days later, Brautisch was informed that Hitler had provisionally set the 25th of November as the date of the attack. On the 9th of October, Hitler completed a lengthy memorandum that he had worked on for 2 nights, outlining and justifying his plans for an attack on the West. He had specifically prepared it because of his awareness of opposition to the idea in the army leadership. Again, he emphasized that time was of the essence. The attack could not begin soon enough. The aim was complete military defeat of the Western powers. He read out the memorandum at a meeting with his military leaders on the 10th of October. Its contents were embodied in Directive No. 6 for the conduct of war, issued later that day, stating Hitler's determination, without letting much time pass by, to take offensive action. When Hitler heard on the 12th of October of Chamberlain's rejection of his peace offer, he lost no time in announcing, even without waiting for the full text of Chamberlain's speech, that Britain had spurned the hand of peace, and that consequently the war continued. On the 16th of October, Hitler told Brautisch he had given up hope of coming to an agreement with the West. The British, he said, will be ready to talk only after defeats. We must get at them as quickly as possible. He reckoned with a date between the 15th and 20th of November. Within a matter of days, Hitler had brought this date forward, and now fixed Case Yellow as the attack on the West had been codenamed for the 12th of November. Speaking to his generals, Hitler confined himself largely to military objectives, to his trusted circle and to party leaders. He was more expressive. Goebbels found him high in confidence on the 11th of October. Germany's defeat in the last war, he stated, was solely attributable to treachery. This time, traitors would not be spared. He responded to Chamberlain's dismissal of his peace offer by stating that he was glad that he could now go for England. He had given up almost all hope of peace. The English will have to learn the hard way, he stated. He was in similar mood when he addressed the Reich and Gauleiter in a 2-hour speech on the 21st of October. He reckoned war with the West was unavoidable. There was no other choice, but at its end would be the great and all-embracing German People's Reich. He would, Hitler told his party leaders, unleash his major assault on the West, and on England itself within a fortnight or so. He would use all methods available, including attacks on cities. After defeating England and France, he would again turn to the east. Then an allusion to the Holy Roman Empire of the Middle Ages, he would create a Germany as of old, incorporating Belgium and Switzerland. Hitler was evidently still thinking along such lines when he told Goebbels a few days later he had earmarked Burgundy for the resettlement of the South Tyroleans. He's already distributing French provinces, noted the propaganda minister. He hurries far ahead of all steps of development, just like every genius. On the 6th of November, Goebbels was again listening to Hitler's views on the war. The strike against the Western powers will not have to wait much longer, he recorded. Perhaps, added Goebbels, the Führer will succeed sooner than we all think in annulling the Peace of Westphalia. With that, his historic life will be crowned. Goebbels thought the decision to go ahead was imminent. All signs are that the pressure for an early strike against the West came directly from Hitler, without initiation or prompting from other quarters. That it received the support of Goebbels and the party leadership was axiomatic. Within the military, it was a different matter. Hitler could reckon with the backing, or at least lack of objection, of Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, and whatever his private anxieties, Goering would never deviate in public from Hitler's line. But as Hitler recognized the decision to attack the West already in the autumn, set him once more on a collision course with the army leadership. Spearheaded by Brautisch and Halder, on the 14th of October, primed by Weizsäcker about Hitler's reaction to Chamberlain's speech, rejecting his peace offer, the head of the army and his chief of staff met to discuss the consequences. Halder noted 3 possibilities: attack, wait, fundamental changes. None offered prospects of decisive success, least of all the last one, since it is essentially negative and tends to render us vulnerable. The qualifying remarks were made by Brautisch. The weak, ultra-cautious and tradition-bound commander-in-chief of the army could not look beyond conventional attempts to dissuade Hitler from what he thought was a disastrous course of action. But he was evidently responding to a suggestion flouted by Halder, following his discussions with Weizsäcker the previous day, to have Hitler arrested at the moment of the order for the attack on the West. The cryptic third possibility signified then no less than the extraordinary fact that in the early stages of a major war, the 2 highest representatives of the army were airing the possibility of a form of coup d'etat involving the removal of Hitler as head of state. The differences between the 2 army leaders were nonetheless wide, and nothing flowed from the discussion in the direction of an embryonic plan to unseat Hitler. Brautisch attempted within the bounds of orthodoxy to have favoured generals such as Reichenau and Rundstedt to try and influence Hitler to change his mind, a fruitless enterprise. Halder went further. By early November he was, if anything, still more convinced that direct action against Hitler was necessary to prevent the imminent catastrophe. In this, his views were coming to correspond with the small numbers of radical opponents of the regime in the Foreign Ministry and in the Abwehr, who were now actively contemplating measures to remove Hitler. In the last weeks of October, various notions of deposing Hitler, often unrealistic or scarcely thought through, were furtively pondered by the tiny, disparate, only loosely connected oppositional groups. Goerdeler and his main contacts, Hassel, the former ambassador to Rome, Beck, and Johannes Popitz, former state secretary in the Reich Ministry of Finance, were one such cluster, weighing up for a time whether a transitional government headed by Goering might be an option. This cluster, through Beck, forged loose links with the group based in the Abwehr Oster, Dorniani Hans burnt Givios and Groskuth. The latter grouping worked out a plan of action for a coup, involving the arrest of Hitler along with Himmler, Heydrich, Ribbentrop, Goering, Goebbels, and other leading Nazis, encouraged by their chief, Admiral Canaris, and driven on by Oster. The Abwehrgruppe attempted, though with little success, to gain backing for their ideas from selected officers at General Staff Headquarters in Zossen. Their ambivalence about Halder meant that they did not approach him directly. Moreover, they knew nothing of the thoughts he had aired to Brautisch on the 14th of October. A third set of individuals sharing the view that Hitler had to be removed and the war with the West prevented centred on Weizsäcker in the Foreign Ministry, and was chiefly represented by Erich Kort, who was able to utilise his position as head of Ribbentrop's ministerial bureau to foster contacts at home and abroad. As we noted, this grouping had contact to the Abwehrgruppe and to known sympathisers in the General Staff, mainly staff officers, though at this point not Halder himself. Through Weizsäcker's army liaison legation secretary Hasso von Etzdorf, Halder himself came round to the idea of a putsch by the end of the month, after Hitler had confirmed his intention of a strike on the 12th of November. Halder sent Stubnagel to take superstitions soundings among selected generals about their likely response to a coup. The findings were not encouraging. While army group commanders such as Bock and Rundstedt were opposed to an offensive against the West, they rejected the idea of a putsch, partly on the grounds that they were themselves unsure whether they would retain the backing of their subordinate officers. In addition, Halder established to his own satisfaction, based on a sample of public opinion drawn from the father of his chauffeur and a few others, that the German people supported Hitler and were not ready for a putsch. Halder's hesitancy reflected his own deep uncertainty about the moral as well as security aspect of a strike against the head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces. Others took a bolder stance, but though loosely bonded through parallel thoughts of getting rid of Hitler, the different oppositional clusters had no coherent, unified and agreed plan for action. Nor, while now accepting Halder's readiness to act, was there full confidence in the determination of the Chief of Staff, on whom practically everything depended to see it through. This was the position around noon, on the 5th of November, when Brautisch nervously made his way through the corridors of the Reichschancellery to confront Hitler directly about the decision to attack the West. If the attack were to go ahead on schedule on the 12th of November, the order to make operational preparations had to be confirmed to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army by 1 p.m. on the 5th. Among the oppositional groups, the hope was that Brautisch could finally be persuaded to go along with a putsch if Hitler, as was to be expected, held firm to his decision for an attack. Halder waited in the ante-room while Brautisch and Hitler conferred together. Keitel joined them some while later. The meeting was a fiasco. It lasted no longer than 20 minutes. Brautisch hesitantly began to tell Hitler that preparations were not sufficiently advanced for an offensive against the West, which, therefore, had every chance of proving catastrophic. He went on to back up his argument by pointing out that the infantry had shown morale and technical weakness in the attack on Poland, and that the discipline of officers and men had often been lacking. The front showed similar symptoms to those of 1917 to 18, he claimed. This was a bad mistake by Brautisch. It diverted from the main issue, and as Brautisch could have anticipated, it provoked Hitler into a furious outburst.
He wanted concrete evidence, he fumed, and demanded to know how many death sentences had been carried out. He did not believe Brautis and would fly the next night to the front to see for himself. Then he dismissed Brautis's main point. The army was unprepared. He asserted because it did not want to fight. The weather would still be bad in the spring, and furthermore bad for the enemy too. He knew the spirit of Zossen, he raged, and would destroy it. Almost shaking with anger, Hitler marched out of the room, slamming the door, leaving the head of army speechless, trembling, face as white as chalk and broken. Any sober discussion of these things is impossible with him, Halder commented, in something of an understatement. But for Halder, the impact of the meeting went further. Talk of destroying the spirit of Zossen suggested to the Chief of Staff that Hitler knew of the plot to unseat him. The Gestapo could turn up in Zossen at any time. Halder returned in panic to his headquarters and ordered the destruction of all papers relating to the conspiracy. Next day he told Grosskreutz that the attack in the west would be carried out. There was nothing to be done. Very depressing impression, recorded Grosskreutz. Hitler had given the order for the offensive at 1:30 p.m. on the 5th of November, soon after his interview with Brautis. 2 days later, the attack was postponed because of poor weather. And that is the end of episode 2 at page 544. Thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed this second episode of Hitler by Ian Kershaw. And show the support for more. Thank you guys, and see you next time.